Hey folks, today I want to give you a really wonderful tip for creating strong compositions or strong photographs. And that's using this concept of contrasts. Finding contrasting elements to take a photograph of stands a really good chance of catching people's attention. And the reason why contrast works so well is it goes into our subconscious, and we are tuned and conditioned to look for irregularities in our environment. Because going back to our fight or flight response way back when, like when we were cave people, we looked for irregularities as a potential sign of danger. So we as humans are conditioned to look for irregularities. And contrasts are one of the biggest irregularities that we as photographers and artists can use. So let's jump in and let me show you a few images and a few examples of what I'm talking about with using contrast to create a strong, compelling photograph. Okay, let's dive into our first type of contrast, and that is the contrast of color. Anytime I can find some strong colors that contrast against one another, I look for creating a composition around it. And in this example, you can see the really bright green anemone against the really dark background. It's a stark contrast that brings the subject of this sea creature into full focus for people's attention. When this image comes up, it's extremely difficult to look away, partly due to the brightness, but largely due to the contrast between the anemone and the black rocks around it. Another example of color. Here's these really bright bushes against a gray background. And what's funny is I happened to be walking through a parking lot during the fall season, and I saw this contrasting scene. The color of these trees was beautiful, and the gray behind it was a building. And so I found a great specimen or a little section of these trees and shot this as a contrasting color. And lastly, here I've got green on red. I've got two different colors. We love green and red, right? It evokes Christmas. It's just a great color combination. But here I've got a really stark contrast between these two colors, tones, tonalities, but mainly color. And then finally down in the barrio in Tucson, I found this yellow house with a cactus growing up in front of it, and I simplified this scene so it's only the cactus against the yellow background. So these are some great examples of using contrasting color to create a compelling photograph. So the next type of contrast that I look for out in the environment is contrasting textures, using the intersection between different textures to create this sort of feeling of contrast and to create some visual interest. Now in this shot you can see this is up in the Olympic National Park. This is some driftwood sitting on a rocky beach, and it was this intersection between the texture of the rocks and the texture of the log that caught my attention and made me want to photograph it. And I'm using this change in contrast of textures to create this compelling photograph. Likewise, this is a Japanese garden in Portland, Oregon, and I've got the texture of the sand in contrast to the texture of the grass mound over there on the right, plus just the different contrasts in direction of lines. So this could also be a contrast of patterns, but for this example I like this in the contrast of texture. So it's a different texture that I'm using to get people's attention. Likewise, here we have a very smooth texture on the bottom and then a busy texture up above. So using textures and that contrast between different textures to create visual interest is another type of contrast that we can use as photographers. Next up in our exploration of contrast is contrasting patterns. Going from smooth to busy. In this case, I'm going from this regular pattern that's lighted to no pattern in the shadow. So it's this contrast. Plus the light and the dark creates a beautiful contrast in the scene to create a visually compelling photograph. I've got this regular pattern of stair steps coming down against a smoother pattern in the background up in the sky. This is the church in downtown Reykjavik, Iceland, and it made for a wonderful abstract subject during sunset in this one winter's eve. So finding this repetitive pattern and contrasting this against a non-repetitive, smoother background, I think created a really compelling photograph. And then likewise, I've got repetitive patterns, or this pattern of, I've got vertical boards in the background, I've got horizontal boards and diagonal boards, and they're all contrasting one another. Like the previous monochrome shot, here I've got a sidewalk that has a regular pattern laid out, and then this yellow lemon breaks up that pattern. Anytime we can visually break up a pattern with a single element, such as this, it creates a really strong visual point of reference for people, and it gets people's attention. In the last pattern example, you can see down at the bottom, I've got this regular pattern and on the bottom, and then I've got an irregular pattern up above in the grasses. So it's this contrast between two types of patterns that creates some visual interest. And the last type of contrast that I want to show you is this contrast between movement and stillness, or fluidity and solidity. And the best place I can exemplify this is at the beach, where I have all of this moving water around the rocks, but the rocks are solid, they're not moving. There's a sense of stability, of permanence, of timelessness, where the contrast with the water, it's fluid, it's ethereal, it is ever moving, it's not timeless. So I've got this wonderful contrast in feelings between unmoving and moving. Likewise, here's another example of that concept at the beach. I've got this wave rushing in, and just as it crashes over this rock in the foreground, I snapped the shutter button and created this contrast of solidity versus movement. Likewise in Iceland on Diamond Beach one winter's morning, and we had a solid iceberg. Even though this technically could move with the ocean, and I think it did eventually with enough water, but I caught this at a time where the chunk of ice was not moving and the water around it was moving. So I hope you like this video. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please feel free to do so down below. And I wish you all a very wonderful day, and keep shooting. All right, bye-bye.